a light topic with simple solutions. So, as you know, our conversations here are more about dialogue than they are about debate. And today is not an exception. It's a sensitive subject with strong feelings on both sides. But with any luck, anyone tuning in to see some fireworks will be disappointed. One thing to note is that today I'm not just a moderator, but also a discussant. I will be putting forth a Palestinian point of view while maintaining, a decorum that allows everyone to speak and ask a question. This is a conversation between colleagues who all trust and respect each other, even when we disagree. So, with that in mind, let me give you some context and background to the subject at hand. This is a conversation. Sorry, the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, adopted in 2016 a working definition of anti-Semitism. And IHRA consists of about 34, mostly Western countries. And the member countries, which include Canada, were asked to start, adopting this definition into their institutions. Now, last year, the Canadian government adopted the IHRA definition as part of its anti-racism strategy. The Ontario and also last year introduced Bill 168 that would have adopted IHRA into the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. But later in this year, actually, in September, just as about the Justice Committee, Standing Justice Committee was about to start hearings on the adoption of IHRA, the Ontario government decided to take it out of the House and through an order in council, or what in the States is known as executive order, they decided to adopt this definition. So it is now, part of Ontario law, and today we will explore what does it actually mean. Now, the definition itself is not really controversial. It's a fairly straightforward definition of, what anti-Semitism is. The contentious part really has been with some of the examples. The definition provides 11 examples, and some of them, actually 7 out of the 11, mention Israel, and there are 2 or 3 specific examples that have been contentious, and we will talk about that and hear the different perspectives, the different points of view on these particular examples. Now, the majority of Jewish organizations have supported its adoption, asked governments and other institutions to adopt it, and including JSpace. There was an understandable goal with that, behind their support, and that is to have a universal understanding of what anti-Semitism is. Now, on the other hand, many academics, lawyers, labor unions, church groups, civil liberties advocates, pro-Palestinian voices sounded an alarm, stood against the adoption of IHRA, because they thought these examples I just mentioned, or some of these examples, use a broad brush, are vague, and cross the line into the realm of political opinion and would silence certain voices. Now, that said, there's far from a consensus among Jewish voices. Some progressive Zionist organizations did not support the adoption of IHRA, such as J Street in the United States, and the Americans for Peace Now, which actually spoke out against it and called it a weaponized definition. Here in Canada, independent Jewish voices fought very hard against its adoption in Ontario, as did the Jewish Voices for Peace in the United States. So, I think we can all agree that there's controversy, and that's why, this session, this webinar was titled accordingly, the controversy over IHRA. So, given all of that, our goal today is to understand the various perspectives. What is the controversy about, and try to find common ground. Now, the format of this webinar, I will be introducing our amazing panel today. And I will then have a conversation with each and every one of them, a short conversation. And then we will have a conversation among the four of us, and then open the floor for questions and answers in the last half hour of the session, which will provide a lot of sufficient time for Q&A. So we will start with Ken Stern. He is the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, an attorney and an award-winning author. For 25 years, he was the American Jewish Committee's expert on anti-Semitism, and he was also the lead drafter of the working definition of anti-Semitism, which eventually became adopted by IHRA. He has argued before the Supreme Court of the United States and testified before Congress, and he is a frequent guest on television and radio. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and The Forward. His newest book, The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine Campus Debate, has been called a must-read, thoughtful and provocative, a gift, a rare and uncompromising testament to free expression, and a blueprint for how to navigate the conflict over the conflict on campus. And as an aside, yours truly endorsed this book and provided a cover blurb for it. Next, we will have Nathalie Desrosiers, vodka, not water. I mean, water, not vodka. Nathalie Desrosiers is the principal of Massey College. From 2016 to 2019, she was a member of provincial parliament representing the riding of Ottawa-Vanier, and then she was a Minister of Natural Resources and Forestry. Prior to politics, she had been the Dean of Law, Common Law, University of Ottawa, General Counsel of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, Vice President Governance of the University of Ottawa, Dean of Law, Civil Law, and the President of the Law Commission of Canada. With Peter Oliver and Patrick Macklem, she edited the Oxford Handbook of Canadian Constitutional Law. She has received the Order of Canada, the Order of Ontario, honorary doctorates from the Université UCL and the Law Society of Ontario. And I'm going to butcher the next name of the award, Le Prix Christine Tournier, Barreau du Québec, and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Now, our third panelist is someone very well known to you, Karen Mock, who is an acclaimed human rights advocate and consultant, psychologist, and educator. She is former executive director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and of the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith Canada, and was founder of the Canadian Arab Jewish Leadership Dialogue Group with yours truly, the Canadian Association of Jews and Muslims, and the Enhancing Social Justice Education Group. Dr. Mock has written courses and manuals for intercultural and anti-racism training and taking action against hate, and has been qualified by the Canadian courts and tribunals as an expert on human rights, racism, anti-Semitism, and hate crime. Among her many awards and honors, Karen was a recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for service to her peers, community, and country. and in 2018 was inducted into the Order of Canada. Um, Yours truly, you already know a few things about me. I was the founding president of the Canadian Arab Institute, a human rights commissioner for 10 years with the province, co-founder of the Dialogue Group, among many other mischiefs in my life. And with all of this out of the way, we will now start our conversations. And particularly, I'm going to be starting with Ken Stern. And sorry. Ken, you're a main contributor to the definition, the working definition. You've I'd like you to tell us a little bit about some of the early days and how that came to IHRA. I know also that you have your reservations about how it's been used, it's been weaponized. So please tell us all about that.
Sure. Thank you, Roger. And first, I just want to commend you for having this conversation. There's so many times on this divisive issue where people are basically just talking to their own comrades and vilifying, people with different points of view. And it's too rare and really necessary for people to have conversations to hear things more broadly. That's one of the points in the book that you mentioned, that we need that type of conversation. And I'm really honored that you included me in this. So the basic story is this. You may remember when the Second Intifada was raging, there was also an uptick of some significant proportion of attacks on Jews and Jewish institutions in Europe that spiked and continued. And there was a group called the European Monitoring Center that had a task of monitoring racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and so forth. So it put together first a report that had its own controversies, was suppressed and leaked. Then I had another report, which I thought was really good, looking at what was happening, why Jews were getting attacked. But it pointed out two problems, which were real. One was there were different countries in Europe, and the data collectors there had no sort of common guideposts to direct them of what to include in a report of anti-Semitism and what to exclude. So they needed some sort of hand-holding and guidance of what to, not to label anybody an anti-Semite, but to sort of know across time and across borders what you want to include. And the second problem was that there were debates in Europe too about particular anti-Semitic acts, about whether the perpetrator really hated Jews or not. For example, some of you may remember there was a famous case where a Jewish man was kidnapped and tortured and ultimately died in France. And it came out that the people that kidnapped him thought Jews were rich. So there was a debate about, was this or was this not an act of anti-Semitism? And that was, something that we wanted to address in the direction to data collectors, that no, if somebody's selected to be a victim because of who they are, it doesn't matter, one way or another. That the third thing is that there was a question about whether there was what do you do if somebody's a stand-in for an Israeli? So the EUMC said, well, if somebody has these stereotypes about Jews, transfers them to Israelis, and then puts them back on the Jew in front of them in the street of Paris, they're going to attack. That's anti-Semitism. But if they're upset with the policies of Israel or an action of the Israeli government and attack this poor Jewish person in front of them, that's lamentable, but not anti-Semitism. And I thought that was nuts. I thought that was the same as saying that somebody who was victimized in the American South, a Black person, you would count it as racism if somebody had these negative stereotypes about Black people, but not if they were upset at the passage of a Civil Rights Act or a Martin Luther King speech. So it just so happened, actually Canada has a role in this. There was a firebombing of a Montreal Jewish school right at the time where the leader of the EUMC was coming to an American Jewish Committee meeting. And I confronted her. I said, look, according to the definition that you're talking about stereotypes and applying them and reapplying them, that would not be included as an act of anti-Semitism. So that got her attention. That opened up an opportunity for me and some of my AJC colleagues and many others who were concerned about anti-Semitism to work with them on a definition that could be a guidance for those things. Now, why did Israel come into this? You have to realize two things. One is this was written in 2005, and the backdrop of it was the year from 1975 to 1991, where the United Nations equated Zionism with racism, and we saw attacks on Jews as justified because Jews were Zionists, Zionists were racist. So in the UK, there was a prohibition for a while of having Jewish student groups. It was also the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, where we saw a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism that was expressed. And there was a correlation, I'm not saying causation, but there was a correlation between what we saw on upticks of expressions of vile attitudes towards Israel, including some that were just, anti-Zionist in nature, and a relationship with the uptick in anti-Semitic incidents. So it wasn't saying that we're going to classify all anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, but we thought to characterize over time and across borders, it was important to have that metric as something to pay attention to. In terms of what I saw as a problem that none of us anticipated is starting about 5 years or so after the definition was passed, we started seeing people on the Jewish right in the United States who saw the definition and decided what they would do is marry it with a provision under Title VI of the US Civil Rights Act, which was an important provision, and there was a clarification in 2010 that said, on campuses, religion was not a category that protected students from being harassed, intimidated, or discriminated against. But there was a ruling that said that Jews and Sikhs and Muslims as ethnicities would be protected. So these groups on the Jewish right started doing things like saying, we're going to put these Title VI cases and complain in whole or part about expressions that we saw violating the definition. So texts that were assigned in classes, speakers that came to campus that said things that in their view were violative of the definition, and using that as a base. So that's the first abuse. I've seen more. I've seen in the UK, the shutting down of some pro-Palestinian things like the Israel Apartheid Week, which I don't agree with, but I think that people should be able to articulate that using the definition. I've seen it used to chill speech, which to me is the major thing. I mean, we're going to be talking here about the legal implications of it. How many cases come out of using it this way and threatening is one thing. The chilling of the people, administrators and others saying, don't allow things that violate this definition. We're going to come keeping an eye on you. We're going to sue you. That's a problem. We had in the United States most recently, Mike Pompeo was saying, basically the groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch may have problems being funded because he saw them as violating the definition. So I see anti-Semitism is real. I think there are things that need to be done about it. As a matter of fact, I think a lot of things that need to be done about it we're not even talking about because everybody's focused on the definition. And those are the challenges that I see.
Now, a number, why so many mention of Israel in the examples? Like I said,
yeah.
7 out of the 11.
Well, we thought it was important. Listen, I mean, people understood swastikas, people understood, to a degree, Holocaust denial, but we thought that these were the things that we saw in the verbiage, the holding all Jews collectively responsible. The one about, denying Jews a right to self-determination, again, was not to say that those things were by themselves anti-Semitic. And in fact, I've spoken out and written strongly that one can be anti-Zionist either inside or outside the Jewish community without believing in a Jewish conspiracy or anything else that's anti-Semitic. But we thought that that was important for keeping the temperature. And the other one that I think is probably the most contentious is talking about double standards related to democracies. Now, the thinking behind that was very clear. You may recall there were bombs coming from Gaza that were going into Israel. and people were saying the Israelis should do nothing about it. And believe me, if bombs were coming, from Toronto into the United States, nobody would say people should do nothing about it, right? So that was the type of double standard of democracies. But it wasn't the way that people are used to saying that if you're going to criticize Israel, why are you not criticizing all these other countries? I mean, as I pointed out recently to somebody, when I was marching for Soviet Jewry, nobody was saying I didn't have a right to do that unless I was also talking about Tibet. And as I put in my book, if you look back at the period of time of the civil rights struggles in the United States, the Communist Party was speaking out against Jim Crow and lynching. And some of the segregationists were saying to them, well, how you don't have a right to say that. You have a double standard. Why are you not talking about the horrible things that are happening in the Soviet Union? One can talk about, even with double standards, put their finger on something that's important to be addressed.
Now, your original intention was to use these guidelines for research purposes, I understand.
Well, for data collection, mostly. Again, there were other reasons for it too that I thought were perfectly legitimate. I did training of police officers with a Canadian officer and some from the United States for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, focusing primarily on the part of the definition that I mentioned earlier about hate crimes being the selection of a person as opposed to do they really hate. So that was an appropriate thing for training. I articulated it to the special envoys under the Republican and Democratic administrations in the United States to say, look, when you're talking to the UN or other individual governments and a question of anti-Semitism comes up, it's a handy tool to point it out and to have a discussion about this is what you should be considering. When the president of Iran talks about wiping Israel off the map, you don't have to say that's not only disgusting, but here's a recognized tool for that as well. When I teach about anti-Semitism, I include that in the discussion in the syllabus of the course. But to use it as a hate speech code, to use it as a way to define what's inside and outside is a real problem. I mean, my day job, as you mentioned, is working at the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. And one of the things we know from how humans look at issues when we define our identity as tethered to an issue of perceived social justice or injustice is we try to backfill our thinking, we try to be more certain, we try to divide all sorts of dialogues into good and bad, just and unjust. That's just destructive. And when you try to use the law, I mean, I see a tremendous amount of problems on this debate on campus. For example, I see the pro-Palestinian side sometimes, not as often as people allege, but shutting down pro-Israel speakers, which I see as a violation of academic freedom. I see the academic boycott as a violation of academic freedom. But I'm also concerned when people try to use the instruments of state to chill and suppress speech we don't like. And as I said before, if I look at the uptick in anti-Semitism globally, what are the reasons for it? Is it because we don't have this handy dandy definition to sharpen our definition of what should be out of bounds and what should be in bounds? Or is it because we should be looking at things like the stress on our democratic institutions? Should it be on leaders, which we certainly had in the United States, vilifying and identifying an other and saying the way to keep our traditions is to really promote things to hate the other? And for those of us who study anti-Semitism, we know it grows best in a culture where the capacity of human beings to see and vilify an us versus them is encouraged by leadership. So I'm more concerned not about whether somebody's going to say something that violates a definition about how we look at Zionism or anti-Zionism. I'm more concerned about some of the anti-Muslim statements that we've seen or some of the anti-immigrant statements. I think that creates the culture for an increase of anti-Semitism. And when we focus on this bright, shiny object of a definition that's used as a hate speech code, we're losing the capacity to have that more important conversation. It would be as if the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States said this: to deal with systemic racism, our major ask is to have a definition of racism. That definition should include opposition to affirmative action. One could be for or against affirmative action for racist reasons or non-racist reasons. But if they did that, we think that's nuts. That that doesn't allow us to look at other issues that are important: policing, structural racism, prison reform, all those other things. So I see it. Not only do I think it's being abused, I think it harms us having the capacity to have a conversation that I think liberal democracies need to have.
Thanks very much, Ken. And now over to Natalie. Natalie, you're a bit of a lawyer from your background, I can see.
Yes.
So the Ontario government has adopted IHRA. What does that mean? Does it have any legal standing? Same thing goes about, I'm not as concerned as the federal adoption, because that was adopted within the context, a specific context of a anti-racism strategy. So what do you think it means in Ontario?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here. And I just want to acknowledge that I am at Massey College, built on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I want to acknowledge their stewardship of the land. So let me say 2 brief points. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I think to answer your questions fully, I just want to say what is important to have for good, effective human rights and anti-discrimination work. How does the Order in Council from Ontario and the definition, the IHRA definition, do in that framework? And secondly, I'll talk more specifically of the legal consequences, if any, of the Order in Council. So first, let's talk a little bit about anti-human rights work, anti-discrimination work. It does require lots of actions, and I think you have on your panel and yourself people that know a lot about what's necessary to actually confront racism in all its form. But one thing that we know is that it's particularly important to hear the voice of people who suffered the discrimination. So for me, when I read the IHRA definition first, I saw it as being a message about, what does it feel to be a Jewish person today? And it seemed to me it was important for all of us to hear Jewish people wanting to articulate for themselves what was the weight of discrimination, how it felt, how is it, how does it feel to have synagogues being attacked more and more often? How does it feel to have Holocaust deniers continuing to be retweeted and to be blamed negatively all the time, to have conspiracy theories attributing perverse design to Jewish people? So the IHRA definition was an actualization a little bit of what it is to suffer discrimination as a Jewish person today. So it's very important to have these ability for people to express how, their experiences, what does it mean to them to experience a discrimination. And we know that that's the same thing happens for Black Lives Matter, is very much about the expression of I can't breathe, very much an expression of what does it feel to be Black today. In Canada, Indigenous racism needs to express itself. And because I had been involved with anti-Islamophobia motions in the Legislative Assembly, I remember well the need for a Muslim to express, what it was to have the killings in Quebec City, to be scrutinized at the border all the time, to be falsely labeled as a terrorist, to have all sorts of employment discriminations because of your name. So the respect that we must pay to the expression of the experience of discrimination, I think, has to be acknowledged. And I see this in the IHRA definition. So when you look at this, then it's an education tool. It's an education for the community itself to find the words to say, yes, when I am blamed for everything that happens in Israel, that's not my fault. I have the ability to to react to this. So it's helpful for people who experience discrimination not to internalize. So it's always helpful to do that within a community. It's also helpful as an education tool, and that's the way I think the IHRA definition works best. It's an education tool for everyone else to understand better how it feels. Now, the second thing that is important, I think, in anti-discrimination work is solidarity. It's the ability to connect despite differences, and it's always to identify our particular struggle for anti-discrimination is linked to human dignity for everyone, for all humans to be respected, you know. And I was surprised myself that the definition, and probably because it's aims only as an education tool, I think initially. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about the mission creep that developed after that. But if it was designed to be a research tool, an education tool, it doesn't fulfill the definition of what human rights work, because it does not relate the definition to the fact that it should be part of a larger plan that connects to international human rights, and that it is important to link it to the experience of discrimination by others, you know, all the time. And we know this, you know, when we were doing prevention of genocide, the Tutsis of Rwanda, the Jewish community is always there, because they always were at the root, wanting to say, you know, the anti-Semitism is a perverse form of discrimination, and it could happen to other groups as well. It's wrong to tolerate discrimination in any forms. So I think we know that targeting groups could happen at any time. It can be vicious, it can be murderous, it can be devastating. So all actions plans on anti-discrimination always aim to not to forget to acknowledge the linkages to international human rights, to the preservation of human dignity. It's not about one group claiming attention about its own suffering, but it's a group that shines a light on the way its own suffering is the suffering of everyone. It's one group that actually does the work of shining a light on what anti-discrimination should be and how it has to be fought. So to me, I think if we remember that in this conversation, I think that could be useful. Now let's talk a little bit about the Order in Council. Now it's really interesting, as you mentioned it, Raja, early on. First, we should know that there already is actually a definition of anti-Semitism in Ontario. It came as part of the Anti-Racism Act of 2017. So there is a definition of anti-Semitism that is linked to the anti-racism strategy that was part of this act in 2017. So, you know, it's an act that, you know, like all anti-racism, wants to address systemic barriers, gather better data, and link to communities to fight hate crimes. And the Jewish community is mentioned in Section 2. It's also provides some ways in which the government commits to an anti-racism strategy and so on. Now, obviously, that was passed by a previous government, the government that I was part of. And so it's normal that the new government may not, you know, be so excited about that tool and want to put its own stamp on it. So that's to be acknowledged. Now, I'm just going to read the anti-Semitism definition that is currently in Ontario, that is the one that was part of the anti-racism strategy. And you will see that it looks a lot like the IHRA definition. So it says this.
Without the examples, right?
Pardon, it was the Canadian Race Relations Foundation definition. So it says, you know, is that okay if I read it?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So it says, anti-Semitism is latent or overt hostility or hatred directed towards or discrimination against individual Jewish people or the Jewish people, you know, for reasons connected to their religion, ethnicity, cultural, historical, intellectual, and religious heritage. So in a way, it's a definition that it's not a bad definition. It seems that to me it's actually quite large and reflects the same objectives that the IHRA has. It expresses anti-Semitism as being potentially hateful, as being speech and physical acts, as being directed against community institutions and the Jewish people as a people. So now what happens is, as you said, there was a private member's bill by MPP William Bouma, which interestingly, I think when you read, and I spend a lot of time now reading carefully the different pieces of legislation. So the private member's bill by William Bouma wanted to include anti-Semitism as having the meaning of the working definition of IHRA and the list of illustrative examples. So in his bill, he was not only talking about definition, but also the examples. And this is very problematic. Some of the examples could be weaponized easily. It's also very bad statutory language to refer to examples without the public knowing what we're talking about. I mean, you have to find them on a website somewhere. That's not transparent. So it's inappropriate in so many ways. I actually also think that examples are not part of a definition, should never be part of a definition, because examples will change. The experience of anti-Semitism for Jewish people will change over time. Hopefully it will get better, but we know that the human minds, and there's cruelty that can express itself. So the idea of having examples becoming a part of a definition is I think worrisome for law reform purposes, for transparency purposes, and certainly I think that was a very bad.
Thanks, Natalie. We have a couple more minutes left, and I'd like to weigh in a little bit. You're in an academic environment. What implications do you see happening in academia in particular?
Let me just focus on this then. Sorry, so just so you know that the order in council is quite different than the bill. It does not refer to the example. It says, Government of Ontario adopts and recognizes the working definition of anti-Semitism adopted by IHRA, but does not include the example. So I think that's a better definition. It does not mention the illustrative example. And I think if we're thinking about what does adopt and recognizes mean, I think that it doesn't mean very much. For example, no way universities will be covered by this. I think no way the Human Rights Commission will be bound by this. Indeed, I think the definition is supposed to be non-legally binding. So I think, in my opinion, the Anti-Racism Directorate could replace the definition that it has used. It hasn't done this. So today I checked on the website, it hasn't changed it. Maybe the Minister of Solicitor General could instruct police services to use that definition. But the police services do have a certain amount of independence. So it seems to me, my sense is therefore it was mostly a symbolic exercise with the practical consequences, not fully understood really. I think we should not be complacent about it, but I think it's far less than what could be expected, but it is a symbolic exercise that will have political repercussions. We're doing it today. People are very concerned about this. And I think what to me is more concerning is I hope it does not signal a move away from the global strategy of anti-racism that would no longer include anti-Semitism. So sorry for going so long.
Now the universities are being pressured to adopt the IHRA definition, and I believe in the States some already have. Maybe we'll come back to this later when we have our four-way conversation. We can talk about that with Ken a little bit. Thanks very much, Natalie. That was certainly a sort of enlightening perspective. Karen, as I mentioned earlier, a large majority of the Jewish community was supportive of the adoption of IHRA, and that included JSpace Canada, the organization that you lead. Now, I know you, I've known you long enough to know that you are not supporting IHRA to silence Palestinian voices, that is not something that is your intention. I also know that you do not equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. So I'm saying this because it's very relevant to how Palestinians, see IHRA taking place. But before we sort of get into that discussion, please tell us first, why did you feel that it was important for Ontario to adopt IHRA? What does it provide you with that you did not have before?
Whew. Well, you gave me a great introduction, because some of the things that you said now I won't have to say about ensuring that Palestinian voices are not silenced. I do want to really thank you for going through with this and for having all of us who have already said that we value each other so much as colleagues and that we support the anti-racism movement and the kinds of work that all of us are doing. I do need to just clarify one thing, because I never like to take credit for something that I was given credit for that I didn't. I was a founding member of the Canadian Association of Jews and Muslims and the Enhancing Social Justice Education Group, not the founder, but having worked with you and having co-founded the Canadian Arab Jewish Leadership Dialogue, the idea of people actually getting together and being able to have deep dialogue and deep understanding of these issues is so, so, so important. And that we welcome this almost as an opening up or a beginning of the conversation, because we certainly can't do it in the short time that we're entitled. I want to make, I guess, 3 main points about why we thought it was important to go along with the majority of the Jewish community in Ontario to support the bill that was happening. I want to make 3 main points. 1, we supported it because the IHRA definition is actually the world's most widely recognized tool, a tool for understanding contemporary anti-Semitism. And I was delighted to hear Natalie refer to it in the Canadian context as an educational tool. And also Ken made that very clear too. So that's really my main first point, that it was adopted by international consensus. And for what it was intended to do, it really can help us understand anti-Semitism in all of its forms, with its examples. I believe that the IHRA meant the examples to be included with it, because if you've got a tool, you need examples. They didn't ever mean for this 3 or 4 line definition to be the only definition, because as such, as Natalie pointed out, those 3 or 4 lines are rather vague. So that's number 1. It really is a consensus document that describes the lived experience of Jews historically and in the contemporary way to help understand what we experience. So once it was on the table, of course, we're going to support it as long as it's used for what it was intended to be used for. Secondly,
which is what in your understanding, Karen? You said as long as it's being used for.
I'm going to get to that in more detail. I just wanted to say my main three points. Raja already warned me that he might interrupt me because I do go on, but we agreed we want to do this as a conversation, and we're so used to having our own dialogue that it may look like that. But these are my three main points. First, it's the consensus document of worldwide Jewry and has been signed on by 34 countries, including several countries who are very anti-Israel in my view and in the view of their own government. So they made sure the wording was clear. And that's basically one of the other main points I want to make. The second point, the wording is very, very clear that criticism of Israel is not de facto anti-Semitic. And it specifies that, as was made clear earlier. And so in our respectful view, it does not silence freedom of speech. There isn't anything in the IHRA definition that says certain words can't be used, or that people cannot be pro-Palestinian or criticize the government of Israel or Israel itself, if it's the kind of criticism that's fielded against anyone else. So that's the second main point. And thirdly, I guess it's kind of related, the majority of Jews worldwide, but I'll speak only for Ontarians and Canadians, would say that some kind of aspect of Israel is part of their own identity. And in the anti-racism world, and dare I say in the world of identity politics, people are entitled to identify their own leanings. It can be a historic identity. It can be because they've got family there. It can be for many, many reasons. But in a world of sound bites, the nuances, it's the understanding of what does that really mean to people that's important. Why is it so clear that it's anti-Semitic if somebody throws out what in anti-racism work is called a microaggression? Why doesn't the same standard apply in anti-racism and anti-oppression work to anti-Jewish oppression? So that double standard of when it's our identity, we don't want it to fall into you're either with us or against us kind of mentality. We criticize people for that. We criticize people for not bringing the nuances and the discussion.
Excuse me, Karen, I didn't quite understand your point about the double standard in the anti-oppression movement. Can you clarify, please?
Yes, now I'll elaborate on my 3 points. Thank you for the opportunity. For example, in social justice education classes today and in the university, in many universities where they are in courses learning about how not to silence and marginalize minorities and how each group can identify its own and define its own terminology, its own oppression, we see that that same courtesy, value is not extended to Jewish members in the class. So there will be that kind of a double standard. I understand from both Ken's description and some of the other people that I've spoken to is that in the early drafting of this definition, it was actually that issue of the double standard is right in there, but that in the end, the European Union Human Rights Group decided not to define any of the oppressions because they felt that the victim groups should be doing their own defining, which is how it ended up coming to IHRA. So do we find, and I guess I'm going to answer my own question because I know people are interested in the examples. Do we find that when I'm told by anti-racist colleagues whose opinions I really value, well, you have to understand, Karen, in these classes today in social justice education, they are taught through a decolonization lens. And so therefore, so I think to myself, it's important to have a decolonization lens. It's also important to have an anti-racism lens, a human rights lens, and an inclusive equity lens, where today in classrooms, we have Jewish students and Jewish faculty, even, who are afraid to let others know that they're Jewish, because they would know that they will soon be either asked immediately, well, what is your view on Zionism? Or they may even, as in some universities, are being told, sorry, you can't run for office because you once went to Israel on a trip, so you're not eligible for the student council. Or no, we're not going to have. Now, I will have people in the anti-racism world, colleagues that I really, really value, say, Karen, you don't understand. You're not hearing us. Well, we do need to listen to each other. We want nothing more than to support Palestinians who are fighting for Palestinian justice, human rights, who are struggling against racism everywhere. And yes, I will say, including in Israel, in the same way that there's systemic discrimination in Canada against minorities. There are wonderful programs in Israel and in Canada that are bringing people together, the heart-to-heart schools, the hand-in-hand programs. And then we are faced with the challenge in anti-racism work of saying, we're against normalization. We shouldn't be normalizing. We shouldn't have people talking together and working together to counter racism. So that's what I mean by the double standard. If Israel is singled out over any other state or any other country for most of the human rights resolutions at the UN, yes, I know, Ken pointed out that if you're fighting for one group, you don't have to fight for the other. And obviously Palestinians are much closer to this than others. They experience this much differently than others do, and need to be listened to and need to be in deep dialogue.
Okay. So, Karen, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's 2 minutes left, and I'd like you to answer the question I asked earlier about, you said, if it's used the way it's meant to be used. And I want to know, what is your understanding of the way it's meant to be used? And to answer quickly why you expressed caution in the op-ed that you wrote, you published in the Canadian Jewish Record in your endorsement of IHRA. As quickly as possible, please.
Okay,
two, 3 minutes.
As quickly as possible, because I'm watching the time and I've noticed that I'm within the time limit so far. As quickly as possible, I really do think, with respect, that Ken and Natalie both covered the issue on how it was intended to be used. It says right in the preamble, it's not legally binding. And it also says that, and again, it is talked about as a tool, as a resource. In fact, Raja, you and I, when we went in to do some training in a local board of education where students who were not anti-Semitic or didn't feel that they were perpetrating anti-Semitism, we went in and we even helped them understand. And we use in our training, we use IHRA just as a handout for some people who want to use it as a tool, but we'll use the kind of definitions that Natalie described earlier for actually doing the work. Or in the we have anti-hate laws in this country. And so therefore, we are not, Canadian Friends of Peace Now, for example, or J Space Canada are not going to take the stance that J Street did, or the American Friends of Peace Now, because we have other forms of legislation that will deal with that. As for J Space and why we said that we're going to monitor the use of it, we acknowledge the distinction and relationships between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, but we do not believe that anti-Zionism constitutes anti-Semitism in and of itself. But we also recognize that sometimes it is used to mask underlying anti-Semitism. So we say that we will continue, and I'm going to quote now from that op-ed, we will continue to call for the use of the IHRA definition in keeping with the drafter's intent to ensure that it does not suppress freedom of speech or academic freedom. And in the same vein, we would expect that definitions of racism or any form of discrimination should not be used to silence speech that does not meet one of the criteria of hate speech. We are committed to monitoring and speaking out against any attempt to misuse, I guess some people would say weaponize, or use it as a sledgehammer. So we will speak out against any attempt to misuse the IHRA definition to attack Palestinian activism or to promote Islamophobia. And we will defend those whom we feel have been wrongfully accused of anti-Semitism. So what we want to do as JSpace Canada, as you well know, is create that safe space that isn't safe in some universities right now, where Jews are silenced, even those who want to support human rights for Palestinians, but also want it to be both ways, that their own rights to speak up about their feelings and their marginalization and their being silenced. We're committed to promoting healthy and open discussion about Israel and Palestine so that we can truly listen to and engage with people who are affected differently by the conflict. And we got to move from dialogue and we've got to move from debate to real action to arrive at that common understanding you were talking about earlier, Raja, and to find common ground. That's going to be the foundation for social justice for everyone and for real peace.
Thank you, Karen. And as I mentioned earlier, I will be putting forward a Palestinian point of view with respect to IHRA so that people can understand why it is, there is a lot of strong feeling about it among Palestinians who have been often silenced in the past by charges of anti-Semitism. In fact, people lost their jobs in some instances for speaking out in support of Palestinian rights. Now, to focus specifically on IHRA, which in Palestinian eyes, it is an additional tool that can be used to silence their voices against their oppressor whenever they want to be critical of practices of Israel as it continues to occupy their people. So there are two of the examples are really I'm going to focus on that are really the most problematic. And you've said, Karen, in your talk about the double standard, and the definition says applying double standards by requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. A number of issues with this thing here. First of all, who decides, what is a double standard and what isn't? Two, Israel is an occupying nation. How do you compare that? To which other democratic nation do you compare that, your criticism of Israel, which is well worthy within the occupation that it continues to exercise? So how do we, who decides, and then which other democratic nation that is occupying other people would you compare it to? So that's one thing. Two, claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. That is anti-Semitic. Now, in the experience of many Palestinians, it is a racist endeavor. I mean, you look at the West Bank, you have two legal systems. I mean, it's well recognized that it's conditions of apartheid in the West Bank, with two populations under two different government systems. So to say that apparently can qualify as, anti-Semitism. Many people claim that Canada is a racist endeavor, a colonial racist endeavor. So why can we say that about Canada and not say it, about Israel? Another thing is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. Well, first of all, that is really, really close to saying being anti-Zionist, because Zionism primarily is about the Jewish people's right to self-determination. And as David Myers wrote in the foreword, this week, he wrote a very thoughtful article in response to Arab and Palestinian academics who wrote a letter expressing their concern about IHRA. And he said, there is no specific globally accepted definition of self-determination. So could that mean that if people are calling for a binational state, a democratic, binational state for Palestinians and Jews to live in, is that denying the, self-determination of the Jewish people? If someone calls for a confederation, so there is all this issue about the vagueness of these broad brush, and you said it's specific, it's nothing from specific, quite frankly. And lastly, with 7 of the 11 examples mentioning Israel, it just creates a chill, and we've seen that happen. We've seen that happen in many cases in the world. Go to the website of the Independent Jewish Voices. They have a whole section on where IHRA has been used to silence Palestinian voices. Not necessarily because people who used it were bad people, but it is because of the chill it creates. And we have a specific case of a town council in London that prevented an event called A Big Ride for Palestine that raises money to buy gifts and toys for the children of Gaza, because the administrators looked at the organization that's putting together this event and saw reference to Israel as an apartheid state. And they thought, oh, this looks like it will violate IHRA, and they did not give permission to the event to happen. So this is happening. And this is the problem, that, Palestinians have with this. And I'd like to open up now for we're a little bit behind schedule. So for about 10 minutes, we have already about 40 questions that have come in. I'd like to get to those. But, having expressed the Palestinian concerns, if I can get each one of you to quickly sort of, respond.
Sure. I presume we're doing the same order. Thank you,
Yeah.
Raja.
Yes, please, Ken.
Just a couple of quick response. One is I want to acknowledge and thank Karen, because we have a different point of view of whether this is going to chill or not. I'm most closer to Raja in terms of what I've seen, but I really appreciate, and I think it's unique in the Jewish world, for somebody to say, we don't think it's going to chill, but if it does, we're going to be there. I think that's remarkable, it's commendable, and I really appreciate you doing that. Secondly, I also agree with Karen very much. If you look at the sort of history of IHRA and the people that were promoting it, it's very clear the examples were intended to be referenced. Otherwise, it makes no sense. It's like saying we're adopting a definition that says, sexism is a certain perception of women, or racism is a certain perception of people of color. The examples were the reason why it was pushed. And if you look at some of the writings at the time, that's very clear. Thirdly, I agree with Karen again that there have been instances, and I have a number of them in my book, of Jewish students who are Zionists who have been bullied in faculty. That's true, and I'm concerned about the anti-normalization things, but it happens in both directions, and that's the problem of the campus, right? So at the same time that Rose Rich, a Jewish student in California, was being bullied because she's a Zionist, there was a lot less reporting of a Palestinian student who was actually doing a lot of conversations with the Jewish community in a Florida institution, who had written something that was critical of Jews, possibly anti-Semitic, when they were 12, and they were being attacked by the Jewish community. It's a group called the Canary Mission that goes after Jewish students and others, faculty members who have signed to promote BDS, that you can't hire them. It's a blacklist. So it goes in both directions, and I think the need in the academic community and other communities, people to say we shouldn't be trying to silence and vilify and demonize, and especially on a campus. You know, this is where I disagree with Karen. The idea is to bring in ideas, to have people expose and examine ideas with which they fundamentally disagree, not to protect people from microaggressions and so forth. In terms of the application, one thing that wasn't mentioned is in the UK, and this is coming to a head in the next few days at the end of the month, there's a minister that said if your institution, educational institution, did not adopt the IHRA definition, you're going to lose funding. And I'm sure you're going to see a lot about that in the next few days. And finally, one other thing I disagree with you know, Karen, and to a degree, you know, Nathalie too, about the idea of who gets to define what. I don't think there's any consensus. I agree with you in the Jewish community. There is a large group, most Jews, myself included, are Zionist supporters of Israel. However, there are significant groups that would see anti-Zionism as part of their Jewish identity. There are groups like If Not Now, which does to a degree Students for Justice in Palestine, Independent Jewish Voices in Canada, Jewish Voice for Peace, and so forth. My concern, and I testified in front of the Congress about this, was that there's an internal Jewish debate of what our connection to Israel means in terms of our Jewish peoplehood. That's a debate. Satmar Jews are anti-Zionists, right? And I think that debate, I don't know if it could be settled, but I don't like the idea of government deciding it for us. And when the government says we're saying anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, they're deciding that internal debate. I find that much more dangerous than using this just as an educational tool and saying that we shouldn't use it as a law.
And we saw that happen in the American administration. They've already,
right.
And they used IHRA to justify that. Thanks, Ken, and Nathalie, please.
Well, I think the examples that you used would be analyzed in Canadian law in context. Like everything in Canadian law is about the context in which the justification for freedom of expression must be analyzed. So I think the chill will be difficult to demonstrate. We've had much more trouble in Canada arguing that the chilling expression is a violation of freedom of expression. I think we're just generally compared to the US, we're much more accepting of violation of freedom of speech. You know, we accept that hate propaganda is a criminal offense, and I've been doing so for a long time. My sense is that the future, what I worry about is a little bit mission creep, is the way, I think, as you described, where suddenly it becomes the only tool in the toolbox to accomplish anti-racism work or anti-Semitism work. And I don't think that it's the best tool. I actually prefer the anti-racism framework more generally, because it does speak to intersectionality, for example. It does speak to lots of issues that the IHRA definition does not capture. And so to me, I understand why, you know, because everybody says it, everybody's passed it, must be okay, where there was a lot of thought given to having a particular definition in Ontario that spoke to being integrated into anti-racism work. So, but anyway, we're now that that has been done. I think the vigilance will need to be clear. I worry that obviously in Ontario, the government has just demanded that university pass freedom of expression commitment. So I suspect that it would be a tall order to then reverse that and ask them to commit to IHRA. But who knows? You know, we've seen many change of tunes recently. So so I think the worry, to me, the worry is that although the examples are illustrations, they may have been intended to capture the whole waterfront. I don't think they do, and I think they are dangerous. You know, I would have preferred principles of decision making. You know, the principles that you have to consider the context in which this is made, the way in which it is. Why is it intended to be? So all the examples that Kenneth described as justifying why IHRA came into existence, it seemed to me could have been resolved differently, you know, from the way in which we argue all the time about, do you call it this or do you call it that, and how do you actually use hate framework or a human rights framework, as opposed to simply deciding whether it's on that line or that side of the line or the others. I mean, every time that you are labeling an action that is a criminal action, you know, something others than just saying it's just ruthless vandalism, you know, you want to name it, but you are in a way, it's still ruthless vandalism you know, and it's important to call it for the crude act that it is. So you know, we have lots of tools in Canada in the criminal code to deal with bad behavior. And we have lots of tools in terms of anti-discrimination tools that have been developed. It is tough for it. I would say it's tough for white kids sometimes to be told, you don't understand what it is to be a Black person in the classroom and feel like they have no voice, but it's time to listen. And sometimes it's time to listen to the other side when you had, and so I just wanted, that's what I wanted to put, is this solidarity aspect of it that shouldn't be lost.
Well, I mean, there are some who feel that if IHRA is weaponized further, then it will have the opposite effect of what it's intended, and that will be a real shame. Karen, over to you.
Well, I just want to endorse what the other speakers said. I would just want to clarify for Ken, though. I did not mean that we should not have these conversations on both sides on campus. We should have them. Absolutely, we should have them. We must have the conversations, and it's when someone is trying to be silenced on either side that we've got a serious problem. I mean, I think that the you know, freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from accountability. In Canada, we have to draw the distinction between a hate crime and a hate incident, let's say, or it's not against the law to be offensive. It is against the law to commit a hate crime. And in fact, it's the regular crime, vandalism, but it's the motivation that has to be shown. So Raj, that speaks to your question of who gets to decide if it's a double standard, or who gets to decide if one group is being favored or another, or that there's mission creep or mandate creep for something. You get to decide by actually having the conversation. What is the context, as Natalie said? Why was something said or not said? What's at the root of it? When we actually engage in the conversation, and by the way, you know that we believe in having the conversation about different solutions to the Israeli-Palestine standoff. Some people don't even want to call it a conflict because it sounds like it's a an equal power dynamic. But it's only by having the conversation, not by ruling it out, by saying, sorry, in this class, we're not going to have that discussion because, you know, we don't talk about anti-Semitism here, or we have already decided what is and isn't. So yes, we do have to talk about, does somebody only object to Israel and the occupation there? Do they speak the same way about other occupations? No, I know that if you are in a campaign to save the giraffes, you don't have to be in an equal campaign to save the elephants. But having said that, we do still have to have the conversations and not silence each other. Most of the cases that we describe in Canada, where maybe someone has been harassed or there's been a complaint made and their job is on the line, had absolutely nothing to do with IHRA. That either it predated or it didn't. So I'm saying that it is what it is right now. We have lots of other tools. The Hate Crimes Community Working Group that we were on together, Raja, for the Attorney General and Minister of Safety and Corrections, they've got definitions for the police and for the judges and for the lawyers and others. It's not something that really, what is that expression? You know, the lady doth protest too much. If we keep protesting about it and not sit down and really have the conversation and listen to what the Palestinians are saying and listen to what the Jewish people are saying, there is that impasse and a decision that's already been made that this is taboo for some reason and that they're not going to be safe in Canada. I don't believe that for a minute.
Well, when certain pro-Israel organizations that shall remain nameless weaponize IHRA and go after individuals, we're all going to feel that this is not where we want to go. And these are not people who are going to have conversations the way we do. And this is why I personally was, disappointed that JSpace could not have had a more nuanced sort of approach. We've got 10 minutes left and 51 questions. So this conversation is obviously not going to end tonight. I think it's the beginning, and I think the IHRA situation really crystallized a lot of the tensions between the communities, and that's why people feel so strongly about it. So let's try and cover some questions very quickly. Question for Ken: why does he oppose Anti-Apartheid Week? Does he think that governments should adopt IHRA?
Okay, no, I disagree with the some of the verbiage around Israel Apartheid Week, but I strongly support the right of students and others to have it. I think that the claim of apartheid is, one can make it more strongly in terms of the West Bank, as Raja did. Some people make it to the society as a whole. And I think it's used in a way to vilify Israel sometimes unfairly. But that said, I am outspoken of the right of people to say Israel's apartheid state, to organize around it. And I find it much more of a threat when the government says, as it did in the UK, you can't have that. That to me is much more dangerous. And in fact, as I document in my book, the Jewish community in the United States was going crazy over Israel Apartheid Week. I know it's more of a thing in Canada and the UK, but I think the Forward did a story. There were like 14 campuses that had something. I saw one of them where it was almost like a dance of the absurd. You had a cardboard fence and a few students handing out literature, to show the separation barrier, the wall, and then about a few feet away there were a bunch of Israeli or Jewish students wrapped around the Israel flag, and it was it was absurd theater. It was not something that you want to suppress. I think it's something you want to use as an opportunity to talk about.
But you know, IHRA is and will be used to silence
Absolutely.
apartheid week.
It has been. And as a matter of fact, the Simon Wiesenthal Center in the United States put out a statement when that incident happened in the UK, and said, not only do we applaud the UK shutting down Israel Apartheid Week, we call on campuses around the world to do the same. That to me is the danger.
Thanks, Ken. This question, I think, will go to Karen. It says, why are substantiated critiques of the actions of the government of Israel conflated with anti-Semitism or construed as hateful of the Jewish community in the diaspora?
Why are they conflated with it?
Mm-hmm.
I saw a couple of other questions there that said, will somebody please clearly say that criticism of government policies of Israel is not anti-Semitic? Well, I'm going to clearly say that. And by the way, anyone who thinks that criticism is automatically anti-Semitic has not been reading the Israeli newspapers or listening to the debates and all the protests in Israel itself. I mean, it seems to me that in Israel, you can speak more critically of the Israeli government than you can here. So when you say why, I mean, it's because people choose to make this a cause célèbre and to politicize this discussion. Why is the discussion of anti-Semitism so politicized? Why can't we also define, someone else I noticed asked the question about inadvertent or latent or overt versus anti-Semitism, we should almost call it the A word, because people are afraid to use it. It doesn't just mean that people are raving Jew haters. It's systemic, it becomes political, and we need it to be treated like any other form of ism or phobia. And the same, by the way, with Islamophobia.
Why can't I say Israel is a racist endeavor?
Well, that needs unpacking. I'll use jargon words. We should have a conversation about that.
Okay, that's...
Say Canada was a racist colonial endeavor, that's what people say. Yeah. Or you could look at how almost every government state in the world was founded. You could look at the wars, you could look at all the conflicts,
okay,
and unpack the difference and what's at the root of what does someone really mean by saying that. Do they mean that there are incidents of human rights abuses that need to be redressed? Do they mean that there's incidents of racism? Absolutely, and we should fight those. And if I were in Israel, I'd be fighting them too. But if they mean something else, then that's another issue.
To be continued, Karen. This is a much larger topic. I have a question here for Natalie. It says, if this is mostly a symbolic exercise, then I wonder if you have any advice on being told by our anti-racist peers and colleagues that we are not allowed to do so, which in turn harms solidarity efforts.
Yeah, I tried to answer on the sides. I think what IHRA does is allow you to call this anti-Semitic. And you know, so it happens all the time. It's wrong to silence others, but it happens on many issues. You know, men said there were silence on women's issues, and so often, you know. But if a man wants to enter the conversation and someone says, "Well, it's you cannot because you're a man," do you call out, go out and say, "Well, because you said that I could not speak, you know, you're a man hater," or something else? When you label and the act of silencing as being of hate, of some, it's a conversation closer. It's not a conversation opener. So I think when people are silencing, they say you cannot speak on this issue, and then you have to say, you have to take pause. Maybe that means that you have to listen first. and put your comments in the framework that you are situated. And some people are, that you acknowledge the fact that you may have to listen a little bit more, and maybe you're going to say something that may be unpleasant, and you're willing to apologize and so on. So my sense is that the difficulty that we're all experiencing in having difficult conversations in classrooms everywhere is not being helped by being told you're anti-Semitic. So that's just my point. It seems to me IHRA is not the best tool to move to the next level. It was just my point.
And we will take the last question, and it's addressed to all of us. What can we do as individuals to mitigate the politicization of anti-Semitism? We'll start with you, Ken.
Well, I think, there are a number of things as individuals. One is we could do things like participate in the types of conversations that you kindly hosted for us tonight, Raj, to air out differences and to talk outside our bubbles. But I think it's also important to have a larger understanding of what anti-Semitism is, to see it as a form of hatred, and again the capacity to define and vilify another. The key part of the definition to me, which we lose when we're talking about the Israel examples, despite the fact that they've been misused, but the part that we're missing is anti-Semitism at its heart is conspiracy theory about Jews trying to harm non-Jews and providing a political explanation for what goes wrong in the world. And if we don't get seduced by the sort of easy answers that we have, this one-size-fits-all shiny object that's going to solve the things, but basically say this is complex, it's historical, it's been around for thousands of years, it has religious aspects, it has identity aspects, it has political aspects, and try to work together to figure out how do we get smarter about tackling it, as opposed to saying if you oppose one thing or you support one thing, you're helping or hurting the cause of fighting anti-Semitism. That will be the best thing, to keep an open mind, critical thinking, larger way of looking at hatred and anti-Semitism, and not being reduced to the lowest common denominator of a handy-dandy tool that's going to solve everything, because it's not.
Well, I mean, we've seen the Trump administration politicize anti-Semitism to degrees that we've never seen before, and so yes, and that's where it becomes a wedge. It becomes an issue. It really exacerbates the gulf between the two. Natalie, any thoughts?
I just wanted to say also that it's important to look broadly at all the institutions that we need so we need good democracy, we need good courts, we need access to justice, we need good human rights tribunals. So because it's not a question of it's a question of trying to solve these difficult issues and recognize the complexity that evolves. We haven't even talked about the fact that women may experience it differently. People that are new immigrants may experience it differently than people that have been here for a long time. So our duty is to actually continue, obviously, the conversation, but also to be clear about the fact that it's a whole. It does require good democratic institutions. Otherwise, it will be weaponized and it will be used to hurt others, because they will be able to.
Karen?
I agree. We need to continue these conversations. We need to ensure that we stick to the values that we hold dear, and that includes democracy, freedom of speech, and human rights, and anti-racism, and all of those others. And I know that in the Jewish community, we often say that it's part of our DNA to be critical and to have these discussions and these debates and to work towards social justice. That's certainly how I was raised, and it's part of the Jewish values. If there are political issues that have come into this, we've got to face them, but we've got to face them in a way that doesn't exacerbate the hatred one to the other and name calling. We have to actually have the dialogue in the context of academic freedom, but also academic rigor and academic responsibility. So we don't want free speech or academic freedom to be violated, but we need to recognize that there are differences in the power dynamics. Some groups have privilege in some context, some groups have privilege in another context. And when we think of the privilege connected in a non-Jewish world with being non-Jewish, when Jews are a tiny percentage of the population, I think it's 22% of the hate crimes in white countries, right? In Europe are against Jews, whereas they represent less than 1% of the population. Now we also see that the incidents against Muslims are on the rise and the greatest increase percentage-wise here. We have to continue these conversations. We have to. And that's how we'll depoliticize them.
Well, in this very polarized world we live in, there certainly isn't enough dialogue and isn't enough conversations, which is why we have courier conversations.
Can we keep all the questions, by the way? The questions are wonderful.
Yes, yes. And
wonderful, and we'll pledge to
apologize.
continue.
We couldn't get to more of them. I apologize, we went over time, but this is not an easy topic. It's a complex one and with many different dimensions. I'm glad we got started today, and I have a very strong feeling that our next conversation is going to pick up on some of the issues we talked about today. I'd like to thank the Bart Center for the Study of Hate and Kenneth Stern for providing the Zoom platform for us today. I'd like to thank Amira Hassan, who did the graphics work for us, and Jeff Wilkinson, who was monitoring the questions coming in. I want to thank our panelists who did an amazing job. One of the big advantages of Zoom is that you can ensure there will be no casualties. Now, we've had these conversations in person before, and there were no casualties too. So, and our audience, thank you very much. Stay healthy, stay safe, make the best out of the holidays, and we will see you in a much better new year, I hope, inshallah. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, everybody. Okay, good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Night.